Her first week in the mansion was a blur of polished surfaces, long hallways, and instructions spoken just above a whisper. The house itself felt like a presence, breathing softly through the drafty corridors, watching from corners where the light never seemed to reach. It was easy to get lost in there. Too easy. The rooms twisted around each other like secrets, and the staircases didn't always seem to lead back to where she'd started. She was given a list each morning, crisp white paper folded on a silver tray in the kitchen. It told her exactly where she belonged and, more importantly, where she didn't. The East Wing was never on it. No one mentioned it. She thought maybe it was under renovation, but she never heard the sound of tools or saw workers come and go. Still, she felt it every time she passed that narrow hallway that bent slightly to the left. The air there was different, cooler, heavy in a way that settled into her bones. The owners were polite but distant, always moving through the rooms as if they were afraid to stay in one too long. Their voices lowered whenever she was nearby. Not quite a whisper, but close enough to make her wonder if they had perfected the habit over years of practice. The other staff didn't help much either. If she asked too many questions, their answers became short, clipped. A few exchanged looks when she mentioned the East Wing. It was the kind of look that wasn't meant to be seen. One that said, "Don't ask again." One afternoon, she finished her list earlier than expected. The hallways were quiet, footsteps muffled by thick Persian rugs. The air carried that faint scent of old wood and something faintly metallic. As she passed the bend toward the East Wing, she felt it again, that pull, the same prickling curiosity that had been growing since her first day. The long carpet there was a darker shade, almost swallowing the dim light from the sconces. She caught herself slowing down. A door shut somewhere in the distance. She turned sharply, heart skipping, but no one was there. The silence pressed against her ears, and for a moment, she thought she heard something faint, like a sigh, carried through the walls. The sound was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the faint hum of the heating vents. Still, her skin stayed tight, goosebumps running up her arms. When she returned to the main hall, the head housekeeper was waiting, hands clasped. "Finished already?" the woman asked. Her tone was light, but her eyes darted past her shoulder toward the east hallway. "Stay in your assigned areas," she added, almost as an afterthought. It wasn't a warning, but it carried the weight of one. That night, as she lay in her small room on the third floor, she could hear the wind moving through the old chimneys, the house creaking like it was shifting in its sleep. And beneath it all, she thought she heard that sigh again, low, measured, and coming from somewhere deep in the East Wing. Would you like me to go ahead and write Chapter 2, Whispers in the Walls next, so the suspense flows right into the discovery of the hidden door? The house had a way of speaking when the sun went down. The daytime creaks and sighs softened, replaced by subtler sounds that threaded through the dark like whispers meant for someone else. She was used to the occasional rattle of pipes or the faint whistle of the wind curling through the chimneys, but this was different. This was deliberate. It started as a soft tapping behind the walls during one of her late-night cleaning shifts. 3 taps, a pause, then 3 more. She stopped mid-step, her dust cloth hanging from one hand, and listened. Pipes, she told herself. Old houses did that. Still, when the pattern repeated exactly, she felt the hairs rise along her arms. She moved on, forcing herself to focus on the checklist in her pocket, but the tapping followed her. Not from the same place it shifted, like someone walking in the walls, keeping pace. She tried humming under her breath to drown it out, but every time she stopped to wipe a frame or polish a handle, there it was again. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. By the third night, she knew it wasn't the wind. The rhythm was too steady, the sound too intentional. Curiosity took hold where unease had lived. She began following it, pausing every so often to tilt her head and locate the source. It drew her deeper into a part of the house she had never been assigned to clean. The sconces here were duller, the air sharper, colder. She noticed a faint smell, like dust and something metallic that didn't belong. The hallway narrowed as she walked. Her shoes whispered over the runner rug, its edges curling where no one had bothered to fix them. The tapping grew louder, no longer faint, but close enough that she could feel it in her ribs. She reached the end of the corridor and stopped. The wall before her didn't match the others. The paneling was a darker wood, uneven, and one board seemed slightly warped, as if it had been swollen by moisture or pressed from the other side. The ornate molding along the top was dusty, untouched, but the area around the warped panel looked cleaner, as if someone had brushed against it recently. She placed her palm against the cool surface. The tapping stopped. The silence was heavy. like the house was holding its breath. She leaned closer, pressing her ear to the wood. Nothing. She stepped back, her eyes sweeping over the paneling again. It didn't feel like part of the original wall. The edges were too sharp, the grain running in a slightly different direction than the rest. She stood there longer than she meant to, the cold seeping into her skin. Finally, she turned away, her footsteps echoing in the narrow hall. The tapping didn't return that night, but she could still feel the weight of that wall behind her, as if it knew she'd be back. And she had been thinking about that wall for days. Even as she worked through the other rooms, her hands polishing banisters and dusting bookshelves, her mind kept drifting back to the warped paneling at the end of that cold hallway. When she finally returned, it was under the pretense of routine cleaning. A feather duster in her hand, her steps steady and unhurried, she approached the strange wall like it was just another task on her list. The air there still felt heavier, cooler. She brushed the cloth over the molding, careful not to make too much noise. As she dragged it down the edge of the paneling, the fabric caught on something, a tiny ridge she hadn't noticed before. She stopped. Her fingers went to the spot, tracing along the grain until she felt it, an uneven groove almost hidden beneath the varnish. Pressing her palm flat against it, she leaned in. That was when she heard it, a faint, almost polite click, the kind of sound wood should never make. She pulled her hand back, heart pushing hard against her ribs. The panel shifted slightly, then swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a narrow gap. Beyond it was a small door set deep in shadow, so recessed she never could have seen it without opening the panel. The door was old. The paint, once white, had yellowed into something sickly. A single iron hinge at the top sagged, and when she touched the handle, the whole thing groaned like it had been waiting decades to move. Dust fell in a thin curtain as it creaked open, the smell of stale air rushing out to greet her. She hesitated. The hallway behind her was still. The only sound was her own breathing. She could close the panel now, pretend she'd never found it. No one had to know. But something deep in her refused to walk away. She reached for the small flashlight she kept in her apron, a habit from working in older homes where the lights didn't always work, and clicked it on. A thin beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a narrow passage that descended slightly, the walls bare and rough. Stepping inside, the air grew cooler, thicker. The beam of light caught flecks of dust floating in the stillness. The floorboards creaked under her weight, the sound unnaturally loud in the confined space. She could smell old wood, dry and sharp, but beneath it was something else, faint but unpleasant. Her hand brushed the wall as she moved, the texture rougher than the polished wood in the rest of the house. It felt unfinished, almost raw, like it was never meant to be seen. The passage curved slightly to the left, and the light revealed a small landing. Something lay just beyond, barely visible in the gloom. She took another step, the door behind her, closing with a slow, dragging sound. She didn't turn back. The corridor narrowed the farther she went, the beam from her flashlight trembling across uneven walls. The air thickened, heavy with the weight of years, carrying a sour scent that clung to her throat. Each step stirred the dust into slow spirals that caught the light before fading back into the gloom. At the end of the passage, the space opened into a chamber no larger than a small bedroom. The first thing she noticed was the silence. It was not the peaceful kind, but the kind that presses in, smothering the sound of her own breathing. The air here was stale and tasted of rot, as if nothing living had crossed the threshold in decades. Her light swept over the floor, and her chest tightened. Old children's toys lay arranged in a perfect circle at the center of the room. Wooden blocks dulled with grime, a headless doll with fraying yarn hair, a tin car missing its wheels. They were not scattered by time, but placed with care, the symmetry unsettling in its precision. A broken rocking chair sat against the far wall, its seat sagging, one leg splintered. The floor beneath it was worn, as though it had rocked back and forth for years, grinding its shape into the boards. She turned slowly, and the beam of her flashlight caught the walls. Faded photographs covered them, pinned in uneven lines from floor to ceiling. Each one showed a face, blurred and yellowed with age, but every pair of eyes had been scratched out with something sharp. In some, the scratches had torn clean through the paper, leaving small, ragged holes where the gaze should have been. She stepped closer, her shoes whispering on the dusty floor. Many of the photos were of children, some laughing, some unsmiling, their small shoulders stiff under the weight of the camera's stare. Others were of adults, their postures formal, their clothing old-fashioned. The scratches were the only constant, each one violent in its intent. Her flashlight flickered, a thin pulse of light that made the shadows twitch. She smacked the casing once, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness, and the beam steadied. There was a table in the corner, low and warped from dampness. A porcelain tea set sat on top, arranged as if for guests who had not arrived. The cups were empty but stained, the tiny spoons tarnished. Cobwebs draped from the handles to the tabletop, like lace, gone to ruin. She became aware of her own breathing again, shallow and careful. The smell of rot was stronger here, mingled with the metallic tang she had noticed before. Something about the room felt deliberate, as though it had been prepared for someone. Her light moved back to the circle of toys. The symmetry was too perfect, the dust around them undisturbed, except for a thin, almost imperceptible trail leading from the edge of the circle toward the wall with the photographs. She followed it with her eyes, and for a moment, she thought she saw one of the pinned photographs shift, ever so slightly, as if moved by an unseen hand. The light flickered again. This time it did not immediately recover. The beam of her flashlight swept slowly over the farthest corner of the chamber. Dust hung in the air like a suspended veil, catching in the light as she approached. There, almost hidden in shadow, sat a large trunk. Its surface was scuffed, the leather cracked with age, and the brass corners dulled to a lifeless brown. The lock was still in place, but split clean through, as if it had been forced open long ago and never repaired. She crouched beside it, fingers brushing away a layer of grime. The wood groaned faintly under her weight, a sound that made the air in the room feel heavier. With both hands, she lifted the lid. The hinges protested with a long, slow creak, releasing a stale breath of air that smelled faintly of cedar and something far less pleasant. Inside lay neat stacks of children's clothing, tiny dresses in pale blues and faded pinks, their lace collars perfectly intact despite the years. Small leather shoes rested at the edges, polished to a dull sheen. A ribbon, frayed at the ends, was tied carefully around a pair no bigger than her palm. Each item looked as if it had been placed there with intention, preserved like artifacts from a life paused too soon. She lifted one of the dresses. The fabric was cool, unnervingly so, and as she moved it aside, something caught her eye. At the bottom of the trunk, half hidden under the final layer of folded clothes, was a small leather-bound book. The cover was worn smooth, its edges rounded from years of handling. Her fingers trembled slightly as she picked it up. The leather was soft under her touch, the pages yellowed and brittle. She flipped past the first few, her eyes catching scattered entries written in a delicate, looping script. The earlier pages spoke of birthdays, quiet afternoons, and the changing of seasons. But as she turned further, the handwriting began to shift. The letters became jagged, the ink darker, smudged in places as though written in haste. She reached the last page. The words there were scrawled in frantic strokes almost tearing through the paper. She's still here, she never left. The air in her lungs seemed to stall. Her pulse roared in her ears. She read the line again. Slower this time, as if the meaning might change if she gave it enough thought. But it didn't. Then, from behind her, a sound broke the stillness. A single floorboard groaned. It was not the sharp crack of settling wood. It was the slow, deliberate creak of weight pressing down. She froze, every muscle in her body locking. The beam of her flashlight shifted slightly in her unsteady grip, casting long shadows against the wall of photographs. She did not turn immediately, her ears strained for another sound. The silence that followed was worse than the creak itself. Her body reacted before her mind could form the thought. She spun on her heel, the beam from her flashlight cutting a jagged arc across the room. It caught on the figure standing in the doorway. It was a woman. She wore a faded maid's uniform, the kind that belonged to another century. The fabric hung loosely from her thin frame, its once crisp edges frayed and stained. Her skin was the color of paper left too long in the sun, her face drained of life yet sharp in its stillness. Her eyes were wide, impossibly hollow, like dark pits that absorbed the light instead of reflecting it. She did not move. She did not speak. She only stared. The air in the room shifted, the temperature plummeting so quickly it felt like the breath was pulled from her lungs. Her skin prickled, and every instinct screamed at her to look away. But she could not. The silence between them was suffocating, stretched tight like it might snap at any moment. Her hand shook, the flashlight trembling in her grip as the beam danced over the figure's face and the edges of her uniform. The woman did not blink. A chill seeped into her bones, heavy and ancient, pressing down on her from all sides. She took a step back, her heel brushing against the trunk behind her. The touch of it grounded her just enough to remember she could still move. Her heart was pounding hard enough to drown out thought. The sound of it filled her ears, each beat like a hammer against the quiet. She inched sideways, testing the space between the figure and the wall. The woman did not follow. She bolted. Her shoulder brushed the edge of the doorway as she pushed past, the icy air clinging to her like frost. The corridor swallowed her whole, her shoes thudding against the boards. For a moment, there was only the sound of her own footsteps, frantic and uneven. Then it came. Tap, tap, tap. It was the same sound she had followed before, but now it was faster. Closer. She did not look back. The tapping matched her pace, growing sharper, the rhythm chasing her through the narrow hall. The beam from her flashlight swung wildly, catching glimpses of warped paneling, dust motes spinning in her wake, and the sharp corners that seemed to bend toward her as she ran. Her breath tore from her chest in short, ragged bursts. She turned sharply into the main corridor, desperate for the familiar warmth of the lived-in parts of the house. But the tapping did not slow. It seemed to climb up the walls, over the ceiling, surrounding her on all sides. The cold followed her, curling around her ankles, gripping at her shoulders. The house seemed alive now, its walls tightening, the shadows lengthening in her path. She could see the glow from the main hall ahead, but it felt impossibly far, and behind her, the tapping was no longer just a sound. It was a presence, reaching for her, pushing her forward with a dread that had nowhere to go but deeper. She stumbled through the panel and into the cold hallway, breath tearing from her chest in uneven bursts. The door swung shut with a jarring thud, and she shoved her weight against it until the warped wood met the frame. Her palms pressed flat, her back leaning hard, as though her body alone could keep whatever was in there from crossing over. Her hands shook so badly that the light from the flashlight jittered across the walls, scattering shadows like startled birds. The tapping had stopped during her flight, but now, with the door shut, it started again. Softer this time, patient. Tap, tap, tap. She didn't wait to see if it would grow louder. Pushing herself away from the wall, she moved quickly down the corridor, her steps swallowed by the thick carpet. The warmth of the lived-in part of the mansion wrapped around her, but it did nothing to settle the pounding in her chest. When she returned to the main hall, the owners were there. The lady of the house stood at the base of the staircase, a glass of wine in her hand, the man beside her with his usual unreadable expression. Their conversation faltered as soon as they saw her. For a moment, none of them spoke. Their eyes lingered on her longer than before, scanning her as though searching for something in her face. She offered a polite nod, careful to mask the tremor in her voice when she excused herself. They let her go without a word, but she felt their gaze following her until she turned the corner. That night, in her small upstairs room, she lay awake long after she should have been asleep. The house was quiet in the way only old houses could be, every creak and sigh amplified in the dark. She told herself the tapping was over. That whatever she had heard, whatever she had seen, belonged to the locked part of the mansion and would stay there. But as the hours passed, she heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. It was faint, drifting up through the floorboards as though the sound had seeped into the bones of the house. She lay still, listening, counting the pauses between each set. It was the same pattern as before, the same deliberate rhythm, now almost coaxing. She pulled the blanket tighter around her and tried to shut it out, but the sound kept coming, threading through the silence, finding her in the dark. And no matter how hard she tried to focus on something else, her mind followed it back down the hall, through the panel, into that room she swore she would never enter again. The tapping always led back to that door, and now she knew it was only a matter of time before she would have to follow it again.